Hey everyone, Mason here, and today we're going to talk about the United States Census and just how it's a little bit inaccurate when it comes to categorizing racial identity, or maybe a bit more than a little inaccurate. Just before we start, I'd like to say that obviously anyone can identify with whatever they want. Don't let me or anyone else tell you how to identify. Now, why is this important to me? Well, I don't really care too much, to be honest, but I'm just a little OCD when it comes to these things, and I've just wanted to get this off my chest for a while now because a lot of things in the census just make no sense whatsoever. In fact, pretty much every single racial category in the census has a flaw in its logic, so this is just what I'd do if I was in charge of the census. Now, this video is just going to be me rambling, not really having any script. And I'm probably going to mess up my words a lot. Normally it takes me like 2 or 3 hours to film a 10-minute video just because I mess up so much. But let's just go ahead and get on with it. I'll try and do this in one take. So in the United States Census, there are 7 main racial categories that you can choose from. White, Black, Native American, Asian, Pacific Islander, 2 or more races, and some other race. And now you may not see a problem with that, but you may be wondering, where is Hispanic? That's not an option out of those 7. Well, as we covered in one of my earlier videos this week, Hispanic and Latino isn't a race, and the race that you're probably thinking of when you think of those two is the Mestizo race, which comprises the majority of Mexicans, Colombians, Venezuelans, Central Americans, groups like that. But there's no mestizo option on the census. Instead, what they did, which makes just absolutely no sense to me, they have the races, the 7 main races, and then they have a separate box that you can check that says ethnicity, right? And when you think of ethnicity, you think of stuff like Russian, English, French, Chinese. That's an ethnicity, right? But instead, what the census does, they group all Hispanics as one ethnic group and all non-Hispanics in one ethnic group. So you can check off the box that says non-Hispanic or Hispanic, and that's your ethnicity, if that makes sense, which it doesn't. And then you check off the other box for racial identification. So basically, if you're Hispanic, I suppose it does sort of makes sense because you can just check off, oh yeah, I'm Hispanic, and let's say if you're white Hispanic, then you just check off Hispanic and white. But what most people don't understand is when it comes to the multiracial groups, like the mestizos, which are half white, half Native American, pardos, who are part Native American, white, and black, actually, and I believe part Middle Eastern as well. They have like 5% Middle Eastern. And the Zambo, which is half African, half Native American, and mulatto, which is half white, half black, which is sort of an offensive term in the U.S., not really considered offensive in Latin America and in the Caribbean at all. So there's no box for those specific racial groupings. So most mestizo Americans, what they do, because they're really confused, they'll either check off Hispanic and then check off white, or the majority of mestizos will just check off some other race because they don't see themselves as multiracial most of the time. Sort of in the same way that I explained it this way, a Central Asian person, someone from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, they are mixed. They're mixed race. They're part Middle Eastern, European, and East Asian, but they don't see themselves as such. They see themselves as just their race is Central Asian. They'd probably see themselves more as Turkic. The whole idea of race is a bit fluid around the globe. But they see themselves not as a mix of groups, but as just one group that's formed throughout time. The mestizos sort of see themselves in that same light, if that makes sense. So what I'd do if I were in the census is just get rid of the Hispanic and Latino ethnicity checkbox. It makes no sense. It's just a way that the U.S. government can track how many people are coming in through the southern border, which shouldn't even matter because what's completely baffling is that they'll have all Hispanics of all races. So you could have a black Hispanic guy, white Hispanic guy, mestizo, Asian, in the U.S. Census, they're all counted as the same race because Hispanic overrides every other racial box you choose. So, if that makes sense, Hispanic, in a way, does become a race on the census, even though it doesn't say that it is. So, it's a mess. It's a mess. It doesn't make any sense. Get rid of the Hispanic checkbox. So, what they should do instead, and by the way, someone that's like, let's say that there's a German person that's born in like Argentina. Argentina has a lot of Germans. But a German person born in Argentina who came to the United States, he would not be counted as white. He would be counted as Hispanic, which isn't a race, and he's not even Spanish. So, again, doesn't make sense. And Spanish people from Spain also counted as Hispanic, not white, while Portuguese, on the other hand, who have pretty much the same racial admixture as Spaniards, they're counted as white. Spanish aren't. Again, this isn't like a white supremacy thing. People can check off whatever they want. It just doesn't make sense. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so get rid of that completely, and we'll get to what Latinos that are of mixed race, such as the mestizos, mulattoes, pardos, what they should check off. We'll get to that later. Now, when it comes to whites in the U.S. Census, it makes sense for the most part, except for the whole Spaniards being counted as non-white. That doesn't make sense. But you have all of North Africans, all of the Middle Easterners, and even Central Asians. They're counted as white under the U.S. Census. So someone from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, someone from Kazakhstan, they're counted as white, which doesn't really make sense. I know some people might say, oh, Middle Easterners, they look white enough, so they'll count. But in pretty much every other country that has a ethnic or racial census, they count Middle Easterners and North Africans as a separate group, separate from Europeans. So that's what I would do, just for convenience sake. I know this doesn't really matter at all. You could calculate it all if you wanted to, but it's fun for me to calculate this kind of stuff. So you have Middle Eastern and North African Americans who make up probably around 1 to probably up to 3% of America's population. Probably no more than 3%, but that's only if you're including people with partial Middle Eastern descent like myself. I don't know if I fall into that category or not. And what's interesting is that Jewish Americans and Gypsy or Romani Americans, they're also counted under white, even though we've talked about in previous videos, the Romani people actually have a lot of recent South Asian admixture. Jewish people, they have a lot of Middle Eastern Semitic admixture. So in Europe, I'm not sure, Europeans definitely don't consider the Romani to be white. They may or may not consider Jews to be white. In the U.S., we do consider Jews and Romani to be white, but that's partially because people don't even know Romani is an ethnic group. They think it's like an occupation or something. So if I were to run the census, I would give a separate category to Europeans, mainland Europeans. That would include groups like Spanish, Italians, Germans, Russians. And then I would include a separate category for Middle Eastern and North Africans, because I talked about in another video, they have a lot more in common, genetics, origin-wise, than they are very closely related to Europeans, but they do have a separate gene pool. So I would consider Middle Easterners, North Africans. I would include the Turkish, Egyptians, Moroccans, Iranians, people from the Caucasus region, like Armenia, Georgia, Afghans. I would include them as Middle Easterners. And I know Middle Easterners and North Africans really don't like to be included with each other for a lot of historical reasons, but that's just what I do. Now, when it comes to the U.S. Census, the exact terminology is Black or African American. And what it means by this, a lot of people don't understand that Black in the United States is an ethnic group, if that makes sense. White American is not an ethnic group, but Black American is, because Black Americans are a result of, 400 years of them being brought from Africa, mixing around in their own group, creating their own dialects, their own culture, and so that does make them an ethnic group. I know a lot of white Americans wouldn't understand. They'd just be like, "Oh, every black person, oh, they're all just the same." Not true. There's huge, monumental differences between black Americans and black people from, say, like Latin America, Africa, especially big difference. So what I would do, I would make it clear on the census that black American is an ethnic group. So if you were born in America, your ancestors were brought here as slaves from Africa, 400 years ago, or whenever it started, then you would be considered the black ethnic group, while more recent immigrants from the Caribbean or Africa wouldn't be considered black American. I mean, they are, a lot of people would call them black. I would just say, like African descended. Now, when it comes to like Africans from Africa, there's a big difference in culture, and they're actually split into a lot of different groups. Like you have the Nilotic people from Sudan, Uganda, and they're very, very different from Bantus from Central Southern Africa. West Africans, I'm not sure if they're considered Bantu or not. I've seen conflicting sources on that, but from what I've seen, they don't identify themselves with the rest of sub-Saharan African Bantus. You also have the Horn Africans, like Ethiopian Somalians, Eritreans. They are very, very different from the Bantu Africans. So I don't know if I would just put them all under one category that says like African, or whether I would like split it up into the groups. And I know people are like, "Oh, you're trying to divide them." No, it's not the case. Like I said, I don't really care who or what you identify with. It's not really my business. I'm just talking about this for the statistical reasons because I find it interesting. That's just what I find interesting. And so Caribbeans, and I've talked about this before, the Gullah people from the coastlines of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, they actually have a lot in common. The Gullah people are descended from Bahamian slaves that were brought there in, I think, the 1700s. So their culture is still really Afro-Caribbean, and Afro-Caribbeans are really, really different from Black American people, like Trinidadians, Jamaicans, Grenadans. They're really different. So I don't know. Maybe I'd give them their own category, and as well as Black Latinos, like Black people from, say, the Dominican Republic, Colombia, Venezuela. But the thing is with them, they have a lot of Native American admixture. Like you look at some of these Afro-Mexicans from southern Mexico, like what's the state called? Chiapas, I believe. Could be wrong on that. From Chiapas, Veracruz, the Afro-Mexicans, they look sort of Indian to me. Not Native American Indian, like South Asian Indian, because they're just like a big mix of stuff. So I don't know, maybe they'd be considered separate. I actually haven't ever met any Black Latinos, as in Black people from Latin American countries. At least I don't think I've met any. It would be interesting to me to see what they identify with. And also Louisiana Creoles, who we made a whole video about, actually. They have a bit more European admixture than most Black Americans, a lot more Native American admixture, and a little bit of Middle Eastern admixture from the Canarians that immigrated to southern Louisiana. So they are definitely a separate ethnic group from Black Americans. Whether they identify or not as Black depends on the person. I know a lot of people get really mad about that, but depends on the person, so I don't know if I would consider that to be a separate category or not. Now, Native Americans, they pretty much got this right. Yeah, the groups native to the American continents before European migration. But what they do, they categorize all Native Americans that are from like the Arctic region, like Native Alaskans, like Aleuts, Inuits. They're classified as separately from all other Native Americans which is smart because I talked about in a previous video. They have a really different gene pool because they arrived in the American continents a long time after the rest of the Native Americans came. So you can see they look more East or Northeast Asian as opposed to most other Native Americans that look. They have a different look. They don't exactly look like East Asians. So they could be separated into like the Inuits, the Northern Americans, like Native Americans from Canada and the United States, and then you have like Mesoamericans from Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, and then you have South American Indians, who are probably the darkest of all the Indians. I'm not sure if that's a product of their environment or if it's a genetic adaptation, but Native Americans from South America are definitely different than Native Americans from the very north of the continent. Now, when it comes to Asians, the U.S. is just really... I got a lot of flack for this, because on my video about Northeast India, the original title was, "Why do Northeast Indians look Asian?" Right? Because in the U.S., that would make sense, because in the United States, basically Asian is used as a synonym for East Asian, and sometimes like even as a synonym for like Chinese. I remember growing up, if you saw an Asian, you just automatically thought they were Chinese, or East Asian, I should say. And this is because most people know the East Asians arrived in the United States. They were the first group. They were very, very early, first Asian immigrant group. They arrived on the West Coast like in the late 1800s, I believe, or even maybe mid 1800s. I'd have to look into that. But in the United Kingdom, they have a lot more South Asian immigrants. So in the United Kingdom, and I think other parts of Europe as well, if you say Asian, then they'll automatically think South Asian, like Indian, Pakistani, Bengali. But in the United States, we say Asian, we automatically think East Asian. So I sort of changed my vernacular so that people understand that. That was like my number one complaint on that video, like, oh, Indians are Asians too. I understand that, but that's just the vernacular we use in the United States. So in the United States, they count all East Asians, South Asians, everyone from the continent of Asia, except for Middle Easterners and Central Asians, as the same racial group, Asian. Which doesn't make sense because South Asians have a really different gene pool than East and Southeast Asians. More akin to the Middle East and maybe even Europe a little bit. So I would say that East Asians should have their own category. That would include Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Mongolians, and Taiwanese, but who are ethnically Han Chinese. South Asians, which would include Indians, Pakistanis, Bengalis, Nepalis, Sri Lankans. But there is a little controversy about the whole Indo-Aryan Dravidian split. You know, from what I've seen, there are no mainstream reputable sources that can refute the Indo-Aryan Dravidian theory. I know a lot of people think this, but I've never met a single Indian in my entire life that thought the Dravidian theory was incorrect or inaccurate. And I know a lot of Indians. The university I go to, it's like at least 20% South Asian. So I know a lot of South Asians. And from what I've seen, Dravidians and North Indo-Aryans, they do look different. So you could classify them as different, but all people in India they're all mixed. They're all Indians have at least some Indo-Aryan admixture. All Indians have at least some Dravidian admixture as well. So it's not really evenly split. It's more like, oh, maybe an Indo-Aryan, self-identified Indo-Aryan has like 60% Indo-Aryan, 40% Dravidian. A Dravidian would have like 60% Dravidian, 40% Indo-Aryan. So I know that's a really controversial topic. Maybe just stick to the label South Asian. Now, Southeast Asians, what's interesting about Southeast Asians, someone told this to me a few years ago, and I thought it was kind of funny. They were like, Southeast Asia is to East Asia, as the Middle East is to Europe. As in, Southeast Asians, they look East Asian. Their facial features, their appearance, but they're different because they're a bit darker, and maybe I believe they're a bit shorter on average as well. Very similar to Middle Easterners. They look very similar to Europeans, but they're a bit more swarthy, a bit shorter on average. So Southeast Asia is to East Asia, what the Middle East is to Europe. So Southeast Asians, well, some people like Vietnamese, they consider themselves East Asian, which is interesting. Some consider themselves Southeast, some East Asian. Filipinos, same thing, but a lot of different people groups have really influenced the Filipinos. Central Asians, I'm not sure whether they should be considered mixed or not. I just say they could have their own category, Central Asian. Same with North Asians, like Native Siberians. The Ainu as well, I believe they're more closely related to Siberian groups. So I'd say North Asian, Central Asian, Southeast, South, and East. It doesn't make sense just to lump them all together as one racial group, Asian, and be done with it. Now, the Pacific Islanders, this one sort of makes sense because they all do sort of share a gene pool, except Melanesians clearly are very, very different than the Micronesians and Polynesians. Polynesians, from what I've seen, it's split like 70-30 in terms of admixture. 70% of their admixture is Austronesian from Southeast Asia. 30% of their admixture is the native Melanesian, mostly from like Papua New Guinea. And there is also a bit of a debate as to whether people like Australian Aborigines should be classified with New Guineans or Papuans and the Negrito of Southeast Asia. I think that they all have a common origin, those groups. When you look at genetic variability by race, you can see that Papuans and Australian Aborigines, they're more closely related to each other than to any other group, so they probably share a common origin. So I'd say split that up into Melanesians, Polynesians, and Micronesians, who are just like Polynesians, except they have a little bit more Melanesian admixture. They're a lot darker. I've seen Micronesians that are really, really dark. I actually knew a couple Micronesians, and I thought that they were like half black, half Asian. So we called them the Blasians because they looked really Blasian, you know. But I guess it sort of makes sense because they're half East Asian, half Melanesians, who Melanesians do have a very strong resemblance to sub-Saharan Africans, but they're actually the most genetically disparate population of any two groups on the planet, as in they've been separated the longest. And we can see this through genetic tests, and there's no reason anyone would lie about that. That's kind of ridiculous. Now, the whole category of two or more races, multiracial, this can get confusing for a lot of reasons because, like I said, Central Asians, they're technically mixed race. You would never see a Central Asian person say that they're mixed. Middle Easterners also are technically mixed race because they're sort of in the middle of so many different regions and groups that they've just been mixing with everything for thousands of years. Indians are also mixed between Indo-Aryans and Dravidians. So this is a bit tricky, but I would say the only people who should be checking off this box would be like people who say have one white parent, one black parent, or one Asian parent, one white parent, because that just makes more sense to me than, say, a mestizo who, you know, his bloodline has been mixed for so long, he doesn't even have any idea what his exact racial makeup is. So he wouldn't check off two or more races. He would just check off mestizo, because that's what race he is. He isn't two or more. He doesn't see himself as both Native American and European at the same time, if that makes sense. I hope you're following. There's a difference between, you know, a person of mixed race, such as myself, who has very recent mixture in his gene pool, and someone that's from a mixed race ethnic group that's been, you know, the bloodline's been mixed for so long, no one even knows what the exact mixture is. For instance, the Malagasy people from Madagascar, they are on average half Southeast Asian from Indonesia and half African, sub-Saharan African, probably from like Mozambique, around that area, and they wouldn't see themselves as mixed race. They're just Malagasy. That's what they are. I hope you guys are following here. And there's the last category, some other race, which is intended for people that don't really identify with anything else. But I think I've covered pretty much every group out there, every major race. So this category is pretty much worthless. Pretty much the only people that check off some other race on the census today are Mexican mestizos, or I should say, anyone from Latin America, and that's a mestizo, or like not white, black, Native American. They would check off the some other race box because they don't see mestizo on there. If they saw mestizo, they'd probably check that off instead. But they see, oh, the main racial groups, white, black, Native American. They're like, no, I'm none of these. And they don't see themselves as multiracial because they don't check off white and Native American. Okay, so that's going to pretty much wrap it up. So if I were to change the census, get rid of the whole Hispanic and Latino category. It just confuses people. Like, I know a lot of people say, oh, you kind of look Latino, you could pass for Hispanic. Anyone could be Hispanic, because there's such a different range in race in Latin American countries. It just doesn't make sense. Get rid of it. It just confuses people. It's kind of annoying. And basically, just be more specific. I do realize that by doing this, by splitting it up, instead of just Asian, you have East, South Asian. I do realize that does make the form considerably longer, but that's just what I would do. I know that'll probably never happen. Or if you want to get even better, just have them write in their own race. Have them write in their own base. Just skip the middleman. So this is my first sort of podcast. I know it's not really long enough to be a podcast, but it's just me rambling. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I'll probably do more stuff like this. I don't know, maybe like twice a week, because I'm trying to do one video every 2 days on my other channel, which is just really blowing up right now. I'm very, very happy with the growth and the positivity on my other channel. I would have never thought in a million years that so many people would have the same interests that I do in geography, demography, people, different people from around the globe. It's just, it's really heartwarming feeling. So thank you to everyone who likes the videos, shares them, gives positive comments. I really appreciate it. Let me know your thoughts on the U.S. Census, or really whatever country you're in, because I know only like 40% of my viewers are actually American. The other 60% are from other places on the globe. Some people might not even have an ethnic or racial census. In France, I believe it's illegal to have an ethnic, racial, linguistic, or religious survey or census of any kind, which is kind of funny. It's almost like they're scared of what they might find if they have a census, which I think that's ridiculous. You should never be afraid of more knowledge. But yeah, go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the United States Census, Canadian Census, Indian Census, British Census, whichever country you're in. Let me know your thoughts on it. And as always, thank you for watching, everyone. Give me ideas for future videos I could talk about, future topics that aren't too controversial, hopefully. I want to keep it just controversial enough to get people's attention, but I'll probably have friends and acquaintances talking with me on a future podcast, so it won't just be me talking to myself, because I'm not really used to that. I'm just talking to myself in an empty room, So, again, thank you for watching, everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.